everyone for coming. This is our biggest and best turnout so far, so this is great. This is the first of a few sessions that we're going to be doing with Peter. So this is pretty exciting for us. He's going to be doing some additional ones in the coming weeks with Space Map Go and some design stuff based around that technology. But today we're going to obviously be looking at the DiGiCo Theater software and Peter's experience using it for the Color Purple show that he did. I guess it was 2 years now, if I'm not mistaken.
Seems like a lifetime ago.
Yeah, exactly. In both Edmonton and in Winnipeg as well. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate. We'll kind of pause as we move between sections of the presentation. But with that, I'll hand it over to you, Peter.
Sure, thank you. And thanks for having me. This is nice. Nice to see everybody too. And I know that's so cliche. I'm getting sick of people saying that when you get on Zoom and, oh, it's so great to see you. But in this case, it actually is honestly true. Some of those other meetings, you're sort of like, are you though? You're just here to tell us bad news about what project's canceled.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So what I'm obviously I'm going to focus mostly on the theater software, but I'm also going to talk a bit about workflow using the theater software and using the DiGiCo consoles. And my experience with it, everybody, one of the nice things about these consoles and the theater software is that it does allow people to work in a multitude of ways. So this is my way of some of my ways and my methodology, and I'm sure everybody else has some of their own as well. So yeah, let's jump in. I'm going to share my screen and, oh, actually, am I already sharing my screen?
Nope.
There we go. There, you should see some DiGiCo software splash page now. The first thing to show you is that even though you have to pay extra for the theater software, which is kind of a drag, but it is what it is. I'm happy that they developed it, and it is worth the money that you pay for it. You actually can use it in the offline version of the software without paying for it. But you have to enable it. It's the same as true with the broadcast software. So in order to enable extensions now, there used to be a much clunkier way to do this, and now it's pretty easy. You just go to System, and you go to Enable Extensions, and you check off whether it's just a normal non-T or non-B console, or if it's theater, you select theater, or if it's for broadcast, you select broadcast. You will have to restart if you're changing the sort of software version or the add-on extension. But once it reboots, you'll see that it'll come up and say theater or broadcast. So the nice thing is that even if you just want to poke around after we go through some of this stuff and explore yourself, you can do that with the offline software at your leisure. I'm not going to go into too much about the consoles themselves. I'm assuming that most people have either used them or, could spend some time playing around with how you route audio and all that stuff. So I'm not going to get bogged down because we don't have that much time today. But one of the things that I do want to preach that I find on the consoles that give you a great workflow. Actually, hang on just one second. I just need to move a window. There we go. One of the things that I find really helps with the workflow later on down the road is labeling your I/O. So if you don't do this regularly, if you're a person who just likes to stare at paperwork and decode these where things are patched, then continue doing what you're doing. But if you want to increase your workflow, if you go to the audio I/O and start labeling things, then all of this information populates itself around the console in opportune moments when you want to use it. So for example, I've just started like a demo session and I've dropped some things in to get us started. But if you go to the rack, you can see that I've labeled some things starting at channel 17 here, or actually not channel 17, input. I always think of it in card slots. So that would be slot 3, input 1 in my world. But anyway, kick, snare, hi-hat, tom 1, tom 2, etc. And it's pretty simple to label these things. But if you do it at this point, instead of just leaving it with the default patch number, then in the console elsewhere, you'll find this information makes patching things super easy. Same true on the output side. And there's also a handy dandy trick that they've given you for labeling things that have sort of a sequential value. So for example, if I'm putting in a bunch of radio mics, I can say RF1, and then I can go down here and say for 16 sockets, auto name, and you can see it populates them all down as 16. Away you go. Same with the output side. If this card is full of outputs for a system. If I had some Aviums here, I could go Avium 1 and then go down again for 16 sockets. And then now I've got my Aviums labeled. So you could take it further and actually, I'll often put in the nomenclature once we know what the Avium patch is to say, AV, Vox, AV, ensemble Vox, drums, bass, whatever. But this gets you going pretty quickly. So now I've quickly labeled all my stuff. I could do the same thing here and drop in a bunch of QLab stuff. Oops, you have to actually have a number to start with, and then it can do it sequentially. I can't type today. There we go. So now I've quickly labeled a whole rack with information, inputs and outputs, and I'm ready to go. The other thing that I use to keep myself organized in these consoles is that you can give a name, a nickname to each card slot, which again helps you when you start doing other programming and other socketing down the run. So, for example, instead of group name mic 1 to 8, you could call this RFA, and then you could go to RFB, and I've already got this drums and not drums. Accidentally turned pen and power on there. And you could, same thing, whatever, QLab A. QLab B. And then over here, and the reason this is super helpful is that, as I say, this information continues to populate itself around the console. So, for example, if you go to some outputs, again, I'm assuming people have at least poked around on a console before, and forgive me if I'm telling you things that you already know. So on the matrix, if you wanted to go in here and open up to socket things, you can see now when I go to my rack, the nicknames show up. And so then when I go to I click on the group, now I can see the individual things. So I'm not having to constantly refer to paperwork to go, oh, that's right, that's in socket 3, output 4. I can actually just see what everything is right from the get-go. So it's very handy when you're resocketing and moving things around, and especially in a theater show where you have, so many outputs to manage. We tend to have so many aux sends and so many matrix outputs and aux sends that are internal to the console that merge into other places and all of that fancy patching. It's nice to have everything labeled, and you don't have to then go back and refer to a piece of paper. It's also as built, right? If it's labeled that way and that's what you've done, then that's what it is. You don't have to, I'm looking at an old piece of software or of paperwork that hasn't been updated. It's with the current patch. So helpful. Another quick trick that I'll show you on this, and then we'll get to some of the theater software stuff, is that once everything's labeled in the I/O, you also can very quickly get around to patching. Why isn't my right click working? That's weird. Again, they give you some little tricks. Now here you can see my groups are all named again. And if I want, I can go in here and I can say RFA. And before I actually pick the socket, I can go up here and I can say, let's do 12 of these. Let's do actually 16, because there's 16 RFs. And I can pick the first one, and then you can see it's just populated 16 channels worth of radio radio mics
And label them too. That's
and labeled them.
impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and um, and then you could keep going the same way. I could actually have done it if you think, oh, that was so cool, but I forgot I also have drums and stuff and all those other equipment. You can go back here and do the same thing and say, okay, 16, and then you pull the socket and it unsockets everything and reverts the names back to channel. And this will work as long as you don't go and override the channel names to start with. If you do, then it starts thinking that you meant to leave it being called, fish, and it won't override it. At least that's the flow that I've seen, is that if you leave it with the default names, it will override them and take the names from the IO. So instead of naming all your channels and then not naming your IO, name your IO and then populate from the IO. And it'll come across. And again, I could say, okay, instead of doing just 16, I'm going to do whatever. I'm going to do 32. And now when I populate, it populates including the band as well. I've realized my layer management is not what I'm used to here, so I can fix that, and I'll show you something that I do in that world too. Close that. So this is how you map your layers, and it's just when I built the console, I told it to do it horizontally instead of vertically, which I don't usually do. But you can quickly move things around to get them where you want them to be. So I usually like going from my console, paging all the way down instead of paging across, but it lets you do either. And then we want to swap that to there. And I think that's enough. But again, one of the things that I like to do from a naming point of view is that instead of, like, I don't really care what the channel number is once we start going down the path of the show. I care what's on the channel. So what I tend to do is I tend to go into these channel labels and I'll copy the channel label information, but then I'll have RFA, and then I'll put the channel information down there. And so my labels end up on the console. You can quickly get to what you want to get to by labeling. As I say, I don't really care whether it's channel 13 or channel 73. It's just about where I can find it. So I tend to change these things all around. A couple of things in layer management too that I'll show you that I tend to do for musicals. I and my colleagues that work with me as mix engineers and stuff, is a couple of things. One of which is I'll often duplicate, like if so that the left side of the console, this is an SE10 by the way, the left side of the console is the same as the right side of the console. Sometimes I'll invert it, but I might do something like that, so that I can get to any channel from this side of the console or from this side of the console. And that's handy if I'm walking back to the physical console and the mix engineers there working away in the center section. Then on either side of the console, I can kind of lurk there and get at some things in program. And same thing with the mix engineer. They can go on either side to deal with whether they're dealing with the band or radios or whatever. Another thing you'll notice is, and we'll talk about control groups in a minute, but because control groups are so integral to how we mix musicals, I often will have, like in this, you'll see in the center section, you'll see that the entire first bank is all channel control group 1 to 12, 1 to 12, 1 to 12. So that if the operator accidentally hits a page button, you always have your 12. I mean, there's some operators that actually will make the entire center section nothing but control group 1 to 12, so that no matter what button you accidentally press, you're not going to end up all of a sudden losing the availability to your control groups, which is, as I say, integral to mixing musicals. That's why you'll also notice that I've got control group 1 to 12 on the left fader bank as well, and on the right fader bank as well. So that if we had a problem with a fader, with the actual fader itself, the motor in the fader or the fader module, and it stopped responding or became sticky or there was some sort of problem, then you could quickly go to either the left bank or the right bank and continue to mix your show and get through it until you can replace that fader. So this is a pretty standard thing that everybody gets used to when putting musicals on these consoles. Another thing that I don't know when this was added, but I feel like it was a recent addition, is they now let you turn off a bank. so that if you don't need that bank, again, if all you ever wanted was control group 1 to 12 in the center module, you could just turn off the other ones, and then you can't cycle through any other pages, which just helps you. If there's layers you don't need, then you don't need to cycle past those to get back to where you're trying to get when you're on your layer. And by that, if you don't know what I mean, when you're looking at a layer, the center layer here, there's the second group, and then I don't go to 3 now. I just go back to 1 because I disabled the third one. And again, you could, if you're really paranoid, you could just make it only this, that you're only ever available to get there in the center. Not a bad idea. So that's a bunch of sort of housekeeping and little setup tricks that I use that help us at least get started quickly on the consoles and get ready for a musical. Before I move on, are there any questions? Anything we want to talk about there? All right. Let's talk about auto update. So auto update is, in a lot of ways, when I first started using these consoles, I was terrified of auto update, I have to admit. And the first couple of musicals I did on them, I wouldn't use auto update because I kept thinking, how does it know what I want it to do? How does it, I didn't trust it. I didn't trust what it was trying to do to update a scene. But then once I started using it, I realized the power and the workflow involved with the auto update, which is pretty fantastic. And I believe the way it works is opposite, essentially, in the theater software than the auto update is to the non-theater software. So in the non-theater software, and if it's not, and I'm wrong, then I'll just say this anyway. I don't use the non-theater software all that much. So in the non-theater software, let's just say you're doing a festival with 5 bands, you could have 5 presets. And in the non-theater software, I believe it works that if you're in band 1 and you make a change, auto update will write that change into that scene. And when you go to band 2, that change won't have occurred in band 2. Each scene is its own thing, but when you make a change, it's instantly recorded into that scene. In theater, we don't want that. We want the opposite of that. Generally, if we make a change, because we're using a lot of scenes, and we want to think of those scenes and how they track from one scene to another scene and through the show. And so if you make a change to your oboe EQ, as you do, then you don't want to have to then write that to every scene. You could relax the channel, but then in, partway through Act 2, when the oboe has that glorious solo and you want to change the EQ or change the compression on that oboe, if you've relaxed it, then you don't have the option to be able to automate it. So the way auto update works in the theater software is that it will auto update a change you make in one scene into every scene, unless you tell it you don't want it to do that. But it assumes that you want to always have your oboe EQ the same through the whole show. It assumes that you want to have a fader level. It depends on what you're setting to auto update. But in this case, I have basically everything set to auto update. And so what that means is it gives the appearance of the console being relaxed. It gives the appearance that the EQ on the orchestra or the radio mics is relaxed, because you can go from scene to scene and make a change, go back and forth, and you don't have to stop and update. You don't have to save the scene. You don't have to save it into any library. You make the change and you just move on with your life. And which is great, because the workflow on a musical is usually fast and furious, and you're trying to grab things, as they're going past. So you don't want to stop and say, hey, can you save the scene for me? And so it gives the appearance of actually not changing, when in fact what it's doing is more like a lighting console does tracking, where it actually makes the change in every scene for you in advance of you getting there. And so what I mean by that is that if you haven't explored channel cues, you should, because it actually, especially if you come from the world of LCS and being a control freak, as I do, it gives you access to what's basically under the hood. So if we go into channel cues here and we open up RF1, we select RF1, this is going to give me access to the database that is in the console. And it's showing me everything about what's happening in the console. So this is channel 1 input, channel 1 delay, channel 1 filters, channel 1 EQ, channel 1 dynamics, et cetera, et cetera. It's showing that it's muted. So with auto update on, and you always have to remember to make sure that it's on, which it is right now. So on the queue list is where you see it. When it's off, the window goes a little bit to a different blue, and when it's on, it goes to this blue. I wouldn't mind if it went to like yellow or something to really just be like, yes, it's on, or no, it's not. But when it's on, you'll see that when you go to look at a channel, this is where window management becomes interesting. When you go and look at a channel now, and I change the mute state, oh, it's not doing it. Why isn't it doing it? Hang on. Make me a liar, why don't you? Everything's set to auto update. Maybe because I haven't saved a scene yet. I have saved a scene. One moment, please. Oh, I know why. Because mute is a bad example.
I was just about to tell you that, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, William.
The one thing that it does,
the one,
doesn't do that.
Yeah, the one thing that I have excluded myself. So I just outsmarted myself. Thank you, William. When I move a fader, you'll see. There we go. So if you look at the fader column, you see they're all at 33.8 or whatever that is. And then as you move it, so again, it's not actually relaxed, but what it's doing is as you make a change, it's populating that into all of the queues. Now you can exclude that. You can be in a queue and decide that you want to exclude that and make a change. And that's how you make, slight adjustments in your orchestra mix, for example. But this is the idea. And so as you make your change, it's automatically written into every scene or every scene that actually is a common value. Like you can tell it that you want to exclude it or have a different situation. But that's the case here. So hopefully that makes sense. If you make a change, any other change, if you turn the EQ on or off, the values will populate through all of the scenes. If I wanted to go into a scene and make a change, so we'll go into scene 1 here, and fire selected. So we're now in this scene. The way I've got the theater software set up, there's 2 modes. The way I've got it set up right now is if you put the option button on, which you see there, and you make a change, that now is writing it into the scene only. So you'll see it turn purple, and the value is different, right? So now as I step into the previous scene, the value went down. I fire next, the value, oh, where did I go? There it is, goes back up, and then it goes down. But you'll also notice that now with option not on, as I grab the fader and move it up, all of the other scenes, they're still connected. It's not like a range. It's not like up to the cue where I made the change. It's now all of the scenes. So this is the one scene where I've got the oboe solo, or in this case, an RF change. I've made that one change in that one scene. And then as soon as I move on to the next scene, it goes back to sort of my standard default value that's going to auto update through the show. And you can see it. So that's changing. But you'll see the one scene, scene 1, it's still at the 8.5. If scene 1 and song 1, I decided that I want those actually to be the same. I want that change that I made I really like, and I need it to continue into the next scene. You can go and click on that control point, and this is where it appeals to the control freaks. You can go in and choose now. You can choose the value and say, oh yeah, I want that one to be the same. And so now those 2 are actually the same value. So this is like these 2 are banana and the rest are all apple. And so if you're in an apple queue, and you make, no, I'm in a banana queue. If I'm in a banana queue, I make a change to banana and it will auto update both the banana queues. And then if I go into an apple queue, no, I'm still in banana. No, I'm in Apple. I go into Apple and you can see it changes Apple now. So you can get these exceptions, and then maybe you've got 3 songs or 3 scenes to get through a song. You could make that song have the exception for the entire song, or maybe it's only for the guitar solo in the middle of the song, and you can choose that. And if you've decided that both of those are a mistake, you can go through here and you can set it back. You can click on it and say, oh, that was actually a mistake. That one should be there. There's also a hot key or a quick key that allows you to pull the data from the previous cell. So if you hold your control key down, like a right click, and you right click, it populates it. Of course, on the offline version, it also activates my auto update or my option. But and so I could go down through here and I could say, okay, I'm going to keep populating these things. And then I could go back and say, actually, that one in the middle wants to be Apple. I'm going to go back and make that one Apple. And there we go. So there's a lot of management, and this kind of thing is something that we might do after a run through. You go back through and, you're doing notes. You can go back and go, okay, I made these changes on the fly in the heat of battle, but I really loved what I ended up with, at the beginning part of that song. I want to make sure now that it's also through the rest of the song. You can go through and look at the spreadsheet and clean stuff up where you found that maybe some spurious data has gotten in there, or something you didn't realize about auto update was on for a second and it grabbed some other control. One of the other things that happens a lot when you're working on musicals is you'll have multiple operators. And with multiple operators, my worry at this point, when I first started doing this kind of thing, was that things like the auto update exclusion, I would worry that, well, what's the other operator doing at that same time, right? I'm on an offline client, and I'm off my laptop at my production table, and William's back mixing the show, and how does he know when I put auto update exclusion on, and I don't want whatever he's doing to affect the programming? But it's actually client only. So it's if I'm going into the mode where my option is on, it doesn't matter what the other operator is doing. It's only what I'm doing that will change things around.
Peter, we have 2 quick questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
One specifically more of a general question, but what percentage split would you say you spend programming kind of offline versus actually at the console?
You mean on a client?
I just mean like this is from
or pre-production.
Yeah, pre versus like actually on, standing in front of the desk, making changes there kind of thing versus, working offline, without a desk or.
Yeah, I would say a very small portion is done offline without the console there, but a lot of that is just about the practicality of, like, you can, in your shop prep, you can get ready, you can rough in your console and all that stuff. But once you've started kind of working on the show, then you're usually in the theater when you're working on it. So you can do a lot. You can get a whole console file ready, and I sometimes have a bit more difficulty getting the racks to be recognized when you're doing an offline type situation, the OptiCore, some of those things. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll go on to the console, I'll get a sort of starting point session, and then you can walk away and work with it and then reload it again. But as to the client side, I will generally during a show, during production, I will be at my production table on my laptop, and that the mix engineer will be at the console. So if that's the question, is how much do I actually do on the console versus using the client? I find the client software really great. And then there's also the iPad software as well.
Yeah, and you kind of work in tandem as well. I mean, you probably don't spend a lot of time in front of the console, but beside it more or less.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, it's true, but also one of the truisms within the theater world is that often the console is in like the worst seat in the house.
Yeah.
Because, they don't want to give up the good seats. So they stick the person who has this massive job of making sure the show sounds great for everybody, and they put them under the balcony at the back in a terrible situation. So generally then we get a production table out in the good seats while we're working, and we can work down there. I've had the opportunity to use the SD7 extender console as like a console remote, because in Charlottetown they have one of those with their SD7, and those are fantastic. So that gives you the best of both worlds. You have a mini console at your table, and in a good seat in the house, and it still feels like a console. Then you're not mousing your way around. You're actually able to grab an EQ or a fader. So those are great. I would love to see DiGiCo come out with just a universal extender that's like, or a way of taking like an empty 11 that's just a big mouse, and let the 11 be a like an extension for your production table.
Yeah, that's come up a few times for sure. I
Yeah.
see it myself.
Yeah, it would be pretty fantastic.
Yeah. There's one other one here from William as well. This almost sounds like a bit of a joke, but I know it's probably true. He says, if you're in a banana queue in a show and you make a change, will all the banana queues be updated?
Yes, and that you can see here. If we go back into a banana queue, that's the cool thing, because you end up with sort of, as I say, different, in your fruit salad, you end up with different options, and those options can remain the same universally. So if I'm in this banana queue right now and I make a change, you'll see all the banana queues update. And in fact, if you go down and make a later queue a banana queue, it doesn't matter the range in between. It's always affiliated with that. But I could go down and say, oh, I didn't mean that here. I started it there, but in fact, let's see am I in that queue? I need like many more screens. I think it was this one. So if I'm in this queue and I go and I option it, I'm going to turn option on and I'm going to make a change. We've now created a lemon queue. So you'll see now if I click on this cell, there's 3 values. There's 3 options. And it gives you an idea of where it came from, like where the option came from. So you can go, oh yeah, that was the level change I made in Q3. It's this one. I can't remember whether you can name it or not. Doesn't look like it. But it'll continue to assemble these too. And if they become unused, you can actually purge them with this button, where you can delete them if they become unaffiliated with any queue in the show. But you can continue to do that and have these exceptions all over the place. And so I'll tend to get a basic orchestra mix happening through orchestra rehearsals and wherever. And once we start doing passes through the show, that's when I'll sit there and I'll make a few, as the orchestra mix is kind of settling, then I'll be making my exceptions and being like, oh, this song is a little bit more about the clarinet. This song's a little bit more about this, or this, whatever. And then that gives us the flexibility. I always think of building the shows in layers. Your first layer is, the basic settings that you don't expect to have to change for the whole show. But that's why you want to have the auto update, because if you just relax those from automation, then you can never automate them. Or if you suddenly decide to automate them, then it's a big pain, because you have to, all this spurious data is there under the hood. With auto update, it's always there with the illusion of being tracking until you want to update it. And then you just hit the option button and make a change. The thing that William flagged for me as to why the one thing that I picked to do as an example wasn't working, I'll show you where that is. When for the theater software, all the different parameters and stuff that you're going to want to look at, you can access that in the options window. When you're running the theater software, you get a new tab called Theater. Clever name. And you'll see that there's a few things here that you have to change. The first thing that I always do is in the option button, I set it to queue auto update. You can also use it for channels and gangs, which I don't. I have to admit I haven't experimented enough with channels and gangs, and probably should know more about how to use them. But for me, the value is having the option button set to queue auto update. So that's what. When that's on, that gives you the power to go through and override the auto update and create these apples and bananas. But then you have the auto update exclusions, and these are all these different categories that when you select this, and you can see mute is one of them and to groups is another one. These are the two that I generally run excluded from auto update. And the reason I do that is because with mutes, often what I want is not, I won't want to, not sure that was English. Often I won't want to unmute something and have it populate through the whole show. It's more often that, especially because the control groups are going to manage the muting and unmuting of the radio mics, it's more often that what I'll do is I'll be muting and unmuting elements in the orchestra. If you have a big orchestra, especially a big percussion section, you may start with everything unmuted, and then as you realize that the percussionist never hits that temple gong except for that one song, you could be in that scene and go, okay, There we go. They finally hit that tom. And now because it's excluded, it's written that auto update directly into the scene, in that one scene. So now when I go, get a transport control or something. Now when I go into the next scene, you'll see it goes back muted again. So by excluding the mutes from the auto update, it means that I can be at the console, and if I want to mute something, I just have to mute it. I don't have to then go, I don't have to option it. I don't have to save it. It's just muted in that scene. So I find it very handy when dealing with orchestras, large orchestras, where you might have a second woodwind mic for flute, and then you're sitting in it going, oh, they never play flute in this song. You just hit the mute, and then you keep moving on. Same with large percussion sections. It does have repercussions though when you're dealing with troublesome radios. So where it can bite you is that if you have a problem with a radio mic and you hit the mute, you've now written that mute into the scene. So what we tend to do is we tend to use the hard mutes if you're troubleshooting, and then it also gives you the nice flashing. So the hard mute means that it's muted and the automation can't touch it. So if you're having a problem with a radio mic, you just hit the hard mute and away you go. So auto update is your friend. Oh, the other thing that I have excluded is the two groups. And that's because often what I'll do is I'll have, I might have a group that's for lead vocal and another group for ensemble vocal. And again, that's a scene by scene thing that I might want to address. So in this one scene, I could assign them to group one. And because I've excluded that from auto update, it's written it into the scene. When I go into the next scene now, you can see it goes away, but maybe in that scene, I want it to be in group two. So now I've just automated those things really quickly. And because that's something that I do a lot, is I'll have all the radios, I'll have a separate subgroup for lead and ensemble vocal, and maybe even further split out. And it lets me, at the Festival Theatre at Stratford, the thrust stage, we have this crazy delay zone scheme that we've developed over the years where there are different delay zones depending on where they are blocked on the stage, and we automate that in. And the way we automate that is that if you're in subgroup one, then you're in delay zone A, for example, and subgroup 2, you're in delay zone B. So this, again, as the show's flowing, you could quickly move somebody from delay zone 1 to delay zone 2 without having to think about saving it or messing up for subsequent cues. So that's why often those are the two things that I kind of exclude from auto update is groups and mutes. Mostly you just have to be aware that that's what's happening, so you don't bite yourself later on with some other thing. So that's auto update, super powerful, and the workflow is amazing. So you can be sitting there listening to the mix go by, and you've got your mix happening, and you're just auto update, make your changes, and then everything's automated very quickly. I'm going to move on to control groups. So for those of you who don't do musicals, the reality of the way a musical is mixed is 97% of the concentration of the mix engineer, I made that number up, but it's probably accurate, is spent dealing with muting and not muting, opening and closing radio microphones. We got omnidirectional microphones taped to people's heads, and they're out on stage. And especially when they, if you get too many of them open, it starts to sound all roomy, or you start getting into feedback trouble. If they get too close to each other, they start sounding all phasey because you get one person's voice into the other person's microphone, chocolate into the peanut butter into the chocolate. It's a bad example because that's actually delicious, but you get that, the phasing and comb filtering that we hate. I was going to say know and love, but we know it. Know and hate. We know and hate. There we go. And so the mix engineer is really trying to only have the microphones open that are needed in a scene. So if there's 13 people out on stage and 2 people are talking, you're just going back and forth between the 2 microphones of the people that are talking. And so that's a huge job and very difficult. And you're following along in the script. This is my good friend Owen Hutchinson out in Edmonton at the Citadel Theatre. Here's his script for Color Purple. He's pretty intense about his scripts, but you can see. So here's his preset scenes, and then the color coding is the mics that he's opening and closing. He's got them color coded by control group. And so here's in just a scene where they're singing back and forth. That's literally what you're trying to do, is you're trying to only open Seely's mic and then only open Eddie's mic. And so the heart of this and the way we achieve this is all within the control group editing. And so in the non-theater software, you can do control group editing, and you go to the control groups in the center and you do join leave and you build your scenes. It's a bit cumbersome, and it's not all that visually intuitive in the big picture. It's great when you're in the scene only, because you can press the button, you can see what's assigned, but you have to be in the scene to look at it, and B, you can't really see the evolution between the scenes. So what the theater software allows you to do is it gives you this whole other new world called control group queues. And what this does is give you a grid that lets you program your control groups all from a grid type situation. And I probably should have populated this with nothing in it, so I'm going to clear this stuff. So when ripple down is on, the idea is that it'll populate the control group sort of forever or until there's a change. So I'm going to have ripple on, and I'm going to clear, and I'm going to keep clearing the first few so that we can make a good example. Talk amongst yourselves. Another great thing about these consoles is they're 12 control groups wide. So you actually, the consoles that only have 8 control groups, that's such a challenge, because you're usually tying up at least one for the band, and then you're kind of squeezed for how many radio mics you can have assigned, because ultimately, because you're trying to mix with such precision, ideally in a complex sequence, you really only want to have one, unless it's a big group moment, you really only have one microphone assigned to a control group at a time. I'm going to go back here and quickly give these people names. And we'll have Bob and Cindy and Carl and Sue and Jimmy and Jimbo and James and Lisa and whatever. So the way this works is you don't have to be in the scene to look at it. So this is great, because the mix engineer can be in whatever scene they want to be, and we can be making notes or changes, whoever it is, whether you have a programmer or whether it's the designer or whoever, or it's the person mixing the show. They can also do this offline. They can be sitting in scene 4 and then be making a change to scene 5 before they get to it. So when you get into, I'm going to turn ripple down off now so that it'll just be cell only, and you can go into assign something. And you can go up here and you can see now you get access to the banks of faders. So as a little trick, I always try to have my RFs as the first bank so that it pops up right away. But this is your assignment page. So now you can actually select a cell. Oh, I did. It's that one. Random. Let me get rid of that one. So we're going, there's nothing in the preset, nothing in top. So we can go into scene 1 now. And we're going to go through and we're going to say Bob's there, and then we want, Carl, and then we want to have Jimbo. And so now when you take this cue, the one thing I'll say about this is that because the theater software is essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, it's like another piece of software that runs on top of the native software. And so what you have to be careful with the control group editing is that you don't mix things. You don't do the join leave that's native to the console, as well as the control group from the theater software, because it sometimes gets a little bit confused with that. But now you'll see they're assigned, and you'll see that because auto mute is on, they've also become unmuted because they're assigned to a control group. So you can very quickly go through, and again, that right click that we saw in the other one works here. You can go down and right click in the cell below Bob, and it'll populate Bob along, and you can keep going, and you can say, oh, actually we don't need him in 4. So again, right click gets rid of him. You can have ripple on, and then you could say, okay, well, you know, Cindy's in the show a lot, so I'm going to go and actually start with Cindy assigned to 2 because I always want her to be on 2. And then you could actually go through, take ripple off, and do the exception rather than, you know, just start with her in everything and say, oh, well, she's not in these 4 scenes, but everything. And again, this happens very, very fast. If you want to add, if Jimbo actually doesn't want to just be Jimbo, if you want to go in there and assign Jimbo, this took me forever to find out the first time I did it because it's counterintuitive. And I wish they actually had a shift key, my kingdom for a shift key on the console. But if you hold shift down, then you can now add more than one person. So I've got Jimbo. I also want Jimmy and James. And you can see they are now highlit and selected. So now when I retake this queue, that's the thing you have to remember is you're editing the database, but until you actually take the queue. Is there a way to, yeah, there is. I just suddenly thought, I think there's a way to fire the queue in the window, and there is. So now you'll see it's still called Jimbo, but if you go up, you'll see there's 3 members now. And if you want to go back, you can rename it and you can call it JJJ. And again, you got a fire selected. And when you go back, you'll see it's now JJJ and there's 3 people in it. And for me, this is super, I don't know whether I evolved my paperwork to reflect the editor, probably a little bit of that, but also it's kind of the way you think because you want to think of the flow across the show. And, you know, I use FileMaker Pro as a database to sort of figure out my control groups and programming the flow through the show. And so because it's a database, you can look at the data in a variety of different ways. And so what I've started doing is I'll build my presets and my information so that it actually looks kind of like the control groups look in the editor. And so you can sit here and go, okay, Sealy, Nettie, Olivia, Squeak, trio. Okay, trio, who's in the trio? And then you can go and refer to this piece of paperwork and go, okay, who's in the trio? And then you can go, that's control group 5. So now I can see those 3 people. But you can very quickly program a show from the grid with just these few questions of who the group people are in there. And that's, you know, you just populate it to look that way. The other thing that's kind of cool in here is that you can create sets. So what it does is it respects the sets in the set list or whatever they call them. It's this set channel sets. So if you go into your channel sets, you can create certain groups of things. So you could have one that's the women swimming. And one that's men. And so for the women, you could go and say, okay, that's Cindy and Sue and Lisa. And men, it's Bob, Jimmy, Jimbo, and James, and Carl. And now these sets appear in your editor. When you do assign. So maybe I want to do an assignment in this square. And you can see now I can select women. It's telling me that it's already assigned it's double assigned at this point, which is helpful. But that's okay. I'm going to go and I'm going to say that one's going to be the men. I'll put the women in there. And the way you can get rid of that is you can hold the shift key down. It's telling me that Cindy is assigned to both. So now I'm going to go through here. I'm going to hold shift key down and get rid of Cindy in both of those scenes. And so now I've just quickly added a bunch of radios in. And you can do the same thing with groups of the orchestra or the entire orchestra to create the sets. And again, this whole thing is super fast to be able to program and move around. Time is flying, so I'm going to say, is there any other questions?
I'll say that Kyle brings up a good point about being able to disable the or remove the join leave button from the control groups.
Yes.
In the latest version of the software. So,
yes. Yeah. So you can go because of the danger of having that situation where you're using both methodologies. There's an option here that says hide control group join leave buttons. You have to restart the session, but you can say yes. And then on the center section, this button is grayed out, so then you can't accidentally use the join leave. Yes, it's a very good point. All right, so another couple of things that make the theater software so super helpful, and they're about sort of character management, and it's some of the stuff you could get at by using exceptions from auto update, but this is a much nicer way to get there. So let's say Lisa has a hat, because of course in theater you've got to have a hat. Just ask any costume designer. If you go into the channel, you'll see this button called Aliases. So the theater software allows you to create aliases, which are a combination of parameters associated with a particular character or particular situation. So in this case, we've got Lisa. We can go in here, we can say add new, and I'm going to say Lisa hat. And so now we've got Lisa and Lisa hat. And this is the part I was saying to Jeff earlier that I don't know that I do this by the book, but it works. And if somebody else has a better methodology for it, I go through here and then now I'm going to update my scene. And once I've updated the scene, now Lisa and Lisa hat both exist. And I can manipulate them. So if I'm in a scene, if I'm in this scene and I go and I change Lisa's EQ and I turn it on and I give some hat EQ, whatever. What I've done is that this scene is the only scene that has Lisa hat in it. So I can go back a cue and you can see Lisa's Lisa again, and her EQ is gone or is normal. Let's say it's normal. I'm going to give Lisa a different EQ for her not hat. I'm going to turn it on and I'm going to, whatever, there's her normal EQ. And as you step through the show, if you can make it so we can see both. As you step through the show, you can see there's Lisa's hat and there's Lisa regular. So the way the auto update works with aliases is it means that Lisa's hat now exists on its own, and it's you can also include dynamics. You can include a variety of parameters, not just EQ, but things that you might want to change. Or if let's say that you have to share the radio is now gone to somebody else, so you want to change their compression and their EQ completely. You could have that rename itself and exist. And so now I'm in the regular Lisa, and I'm going to make a change to this EQ. And you can see if I'm in any regular Lisa cue, it stays fine. But I go to Lisa hat, and it's different. Now we're sitting in the hat, and we're only there briefly, and I'm scrambling, trying to fix this hat. It's terrible. I can make my change, and then the engineer takes their next cue. It goes back to the non-Lisa hat. But then when I go back, the changes I was scrambling to make are saved, because the auto update will populate it. It knows that it's supposed to be different. And I can, furthermore, I can go in now in my control group cues. You'll see, oh, you won't. If I close it, you won't see it. You'll see if I go and try to assign somebody to a scene, you'll see there's Lisa and Lisa hat now. So now I can choose which scene Lisa hat exists in. And I can essentially choose it. And I can make it that later on when she comes back later and she's wearing the same hat, I can change to the Lisa hat. The cool thing is that if I make a change and finally nail that EQ when we're sitting in this scene, when she puts the hat back on and comes back in Act 2, that EQ that I changed here will still be there. And so the alias side of things is super powerful. You can just keep adding more and more aliases. You can have hat 1, hat 2, hat 7, fishbowl, lampshade, whatever, and just keep going with it. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure. Somebody said to me, oh, you need to set up the aliases before you start building scenes. I've tried it that way. This is the way that works for me. And so this is the way.
Nothing wrong with that. That's a very accurate way to do it. So.
Yeah. But so there's huge power in that, because again, you don't, one of the nice things about the workflow with the theater software is you don't have to stop and think, like if you set it up right and are working with it right, you don't have to stop and think, oh, am I going to screw this up later? Or do I have to save this? You're in the scene, it's the hat EQ, you change it, you're done. And again, and there's also, again, you can go and look in the channel cues and you can see some of these things. If I go and find Lisa, if I look at Lisa, you can see some details about Lisa. If we close out channel 1. And you can start to see some details about, the open and close is about the fact that they're assigned to control groups. And the Lisa hat name, you could change the name of the control group, any of these things. So this is really handy to actually, especially if you find that something's happening and you don't know why, because sometimes you get so many exclusions or you get so many layers of programming, you might go, this keeps changing and I'm not sure why. It shouldn't. You can go back here and look at the EQ or whatever, alias or whatever, and fix it. So aliases are super powerful. And I mean, you could go crazy with it. You could say, okay, we're doing Tommy and we want the snare drum to sound very different for these 3 songs than those songs. You could actually have an alias on the snare drum so that it's got its own EQ and compression for these 3 songs. And, it's not just radio mics. So that's super powerful. Any questions about that?
We just have one from from Peter out west. Just wondering about what your best advice is to speed up programming on, tight turnaround shows with only a couple of days of programming time. What's your best way to keep that quick?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you can do the whole programming offline. You can do it. There's nothing wrong with that. I just find that in my situations, I'm usually in the theater, but it's true. Like if you're running show A and show B is in rehearsal and you need to get ready for it, you can do all of this stuff can be done offline and then just upload the show. And if it's a similar orchestra or it's the same drum kit or whatever, you can pull all those settings over to get you started. But I find that the workflow goes really fast. These control group cues, the control group cue editor is amazing to be able to just punch this stuff in. You might have 100 cues and you could program the show in a very short period of time, if it's all mapped out and planned out.
Peter, I'm just curious, do you utilize virtual sound check, multi-track recording and virtual sound check, and go back and work on the show when the performers are out of the venue?
Yeah, when you can, absolutely. It's also great for training or for practicing a really tricky spot in a show, to be able to go back and do that. So yeah, the virtual sound check thing is fantastic. Love that. So many great tools actually to continue to make things better. I mean, the challenge with that is always finding the time, right? Especially if, everyone wants to maximize their time in the theater. So it's just being able to find that time where, especially at a place like Stratford, where if it's not your show, it's another show, a completely different show. And so sometimes it's hard to actually get at the theater to be able to do that. Be nice to have a offline training suite where you could go in, load your show and your tracks and practice. I know a lot of the big Broadway long running shows have that kind of situation for working in new operators. And that's, 10, 15 years ago, that was a pipe dream. And now it's pretty commonplace. It's a great feature.
Do you ever get into using the players functionality?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to show. So the alias allows you to get into the microcosm of, a character who has a different situation scene to scene. But what they've also added is something called players. And so let's say with Lisa, Lisa has an understudy or there's an alternate or you have to change the person out. And, oh man, the wrong page. Oh, it's its own menu, isn't it? Yeah, players. So the idea with players is to have to be able to compensate for a completely different person playing the role. So an understudy, or let's say the person gets changed out and recast, or an alternate situation. You could come over and you could say, okay, Lisa, we're going to have a new player, and you want to verify which settings are actually captured as part of the player, and that's in this theater page. So we're going to do filters, EQ, and dynamics. It's pretty rare that you're going to do aux sends or something like that, or delay. So these are sort of the holy trinity of playerdom. But basically, you need whatever it's set to when you create the player, you can't modify it later. You'd have to delete the player and do it again. So we're going to say, yes, this is perfect. We love it. And then now we're allowed to create. So now we're gonna have like I don't know. We're gonna have I don't know. I'm running out of names. Pip. There we go. I don't know why Pip, but Pip. So now we have Pip, and we're going to add another one, and we're going to have Pop. And so now we have Pip or Pop as Lisa. It says Lisa Hat, which is just a bit of a legacy from the last time I named that channel was I made it Lisa Hat. So it's coming up that way. When you create a new player, it's basically like it's a whole new pass of the show for a different person. And when they start, they inherit the settings of the person who originated the role, let's say. So now when I go to Pop, Pop is now a whole different situation. And not only is Pop got their own set of settings, but they also have all the same alias situation. So now we're in Pop. As soon as you take your first cue in Pop's configuration, we're now actually updating Pop, not Pip. Pip is now stored for when Pip comes back. All those settings are there. But I can go in and I can say, well, Pip, when Pip wears the hat, it's totally different. It's I don't know why, but Pip just sounds totally different. So that's Pip's hat alias. And I'm going to go back. And then Pip's EQ, we get them out on stage for 5 seconds before the show. And we dial in a quick EQ that's for Pop. And then now we go. We've got, so now they've got their own settings to start with, but not only that, auto update is now changing those things. So you get them into the show, they're in the first scene and you think, oh, that EQ is not quite right. I'm going to grab it and I'm going to make a change. There it is. As you step through, you're now, there's the hat, there's the not hat, and away you go. But this is now saved just as Pop. This is Pop on for Lisa. If you decide if Pip comes back, you go in to players and you say, okay, Pop's back. And now as soon as you start taking cues, it's the old Pip EQ, which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about the flexibility of what that does, especially on a long-running show or a show where you've got an alternate. You're now able to make those changes and not have to be like, oh, this person is on, let's save all these EQs into a library. And then tomorrow when the regular person's back, we repaste them back in and we made these changes. It just saves it for you. And in a really long running show, you might have somebody who left the show and then 2 years later comes back to the show. And you could just have your library here of players and just keep changing them around. And every channel can have players. And I don't know if there's a limit on the number of players. Maybe somebody does, but you can just keep adding more and more players. And so again, in a musical, to be able to have that kind of setting management, let's call it, is pretty fantastic. Between aliases and players and auto update exclusions, it's unbelievably powerful what you can do and how you can shape and how it influences your workflow. The workflow just goes so fast.
Peter, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, please.
So you can definitely see how the parameters like EQ and dynamics would be updated as you change. Just it doesn't seem to update the name anywhere, or does the name that you've assigned it show up anywhere?
For player?
Yes.
I'm not sure. Let me see if maybe somebody knows the answer. I think I know. Let's see. It would be under. If we go to options, let's see if name is, no, I don't see name there as an option. Unless it's stored within input roots, but yeah, but again, like I suppose it depends on how you think of your show. I'm one, maybe it's because I'm bad with names, that think of that Carl is the character in the show, not the actor. And so if Pip is in for Carl, then it's still Carl. It just happens to be Pip. And if they're in, once the show's started, I don't necessarily have to think about whether, like, it manages it for you. So you don't really have to think about who it is up there, right? Because you make the change. And then as long as the next time when you start the show, you go back to whoever's actually doing that track that day, then you don't really have to think about the name. But no, it doesn't seem to populate the channel fader with the name. But it does with aliases. You can pop back and forth with hat and not hat, or lampshade. The last thing that I'll just point out really quickly is that you also get within the matrix, you get access to the delay matrix. We haven't really had a chance to look at color purple, but the cool thing about when you go to delays is that at every cross point you can actually set a different delay. So we use that a lot for, if you're painting a slightly different picture of your band, or a dramatically different picture of your band, like let's say you have your orchestra really just into your proscenium left and right, and not into your center cluster, and you have your radios mostly in your center cluster, then what do you do about front fills or infills or outfills or under balconies or over balconies, all these other fill systems that you might want to use for either of those pictures? And using the delay matrix allows you to say, okay, an infill that's, low in the proscenium on the left, for example, that's going to be closer to your proscenium system than it is to your center cluster. So it allows you to have a longer delay. You can add some delay for the vocals because the vocals are going to want to time out with the center cluster, for example. Same with front fills. They might be closer to your proscenium system than the vocals. The vocals you might want to either push back because the cast's on stage, not in an orchestra pit, or just to time out with the center cluster better. So this ability to actually add this delay matrix level in a musical is super powerful, to be able to, you're not just sending everything everywhere in a musical. You're always painting these pictures with the sound system that you have available. And often that means having a different setting for the orchestra than for vocals. And then the ensemble might be somewhere in between. The ensemble vocals might be wider in the proscenium, so more in the proscenium than, say, the lead vocals, but still a little centered. And so you can play with the delay matrix to really time things out in a good way. And the last thing that I could show you quickly within, are we okay for time?
We're a little over, but if anybody wants to, hang in there, you can have a look at that file for sure.
I'm just going to load the color purple file, or some version of the color purple from. And so one of the other things that's really great about these consoles is when you're dealing with people who are double packed. So we'll wait for the console to finish loading. Oh, I just loaded the wrong show. This is actually Carolina Change from Toronto. Well, that was a good show too. So if you look at Carolyn's channel, for example, you'll see that every channel on these consoles has two inputs, the main input and the alt input. And so if you socket the backup radio to be on the alt input, then you can easily just go back and forth between your main and your backup. And we generally will assign these to macros on the console. There's a whole macro editor. And so you can just hit a button and to go back and forth between the two. And each input has its own gain structure as well, because this doesn't really, the patch happens sort of post preamp. So if you, let's say you're using two different types of radios or two different labs, then you could actually have different gain structure as well to compensate, to make the radios show up at the same level. So again, for theater where you might have two labs, two microphones on and two packs on an important character, or on the whole cast. When we did Chorus Line at Stratford, we had 19 people who were double packed because they never left the stage. And so there's a couple of cool things about that. One is assigning them to macros. I was going to show you in color purple that Owen has a cool thing. They use Wave Tools out there, another fine product. You guys still distribute Wave Tools, don't you? I think so.
Actually, they got purchased by Shure. So
Boo.
we're waiting to see exactly. I think
See
it's
what
going to be
happens.
integrated into maybe into Wireless Workbench or something like that. So not
Oh,
quite
neat.
sure just yet. So
It's pretty cool software, and they use it out in Edmonton. And one of the cool things that Owen has done out there is that when they have their macros set up, well, maybe I will open that console. When they have, let's see, color purple. Yes. When they set up their macros to switch back and forth between microphones, they also have a little setup where they send MIDI messages to Wave Tools, and I think that's a pretty cool thing. So Wave Tools is a radio monitoring and diagnostic system, and it does some really cool things. You could probably do a whole seminar just on that if you guys are going to continue to distribute it. But once this is loaded, I'll quickly just show you under the hood there. So for some of the alternate, like the backup radios, so Sealy Main, for example, if we go and look at the editor for Sealy Main, you can see it toggles the input from the main channel. The main. What am I trying to say? The RF channel toggles from main input to alternate input. Where the backup radio used to be also toggles, which is important because then you can see metering on what was the bad radio because it's now patched into the backup. But see this MIDI thing. So what Owen has set up out there is he'll send a MIDI message to Wave Tools for a variety of standard messages that get sent out on Wave Tools. So he'll hit a button to go to backup, and the A2 will get a message on their Wave Tools client that says Sealy now on backup. And so they'll get an indication right away that the front of house has had to go to the backup, and they can quickly jump on it and troubleshoot. He also has little macros set up to send sort of standard messages off to the A2 as well. So if the A2 texts puts in the text chat something about somebody that's don't use Sealy Main, and then he can just press the button that says copy that generates a MIDI note, and through Wave Tools just sends a message that says copy, so that lets the A2 know. He doesn't have to key the walkie or anything, just lets the A2 know that he got the message. And so he has a whole standard set of a bunch of little messages. You can clear the chat, a bunch of things to interface over MIDI with Wave Tools. So that's kind of a cool functionality there too, to let the A2 know what's going on. Same with top of the show. So at the top of the show, he'll toggle everything back and forth, and so they all sort of test that whole system to make sure that it's all working. Yeah, another thing you can just see from the console file here that you can take some of the most used faders or meters and put them on your main screen, so that when you're running the show, you can actually keep your eye on these faders that are important in front of you. Some weird snap to grid going on that I can't move that to where I want it to go, but you can see there's Sealy backup, and certain things you want to be able to just see, so that if you're getting clip or getting problem, it's right in front of you. That's super smart. And yeah, what else? What else can I show you? I think those were, it was pretty quick, but those were some of the things. One other thing that you want to do if you're using the theater software is every once in a while, usually I try and do it every day or two, or preach to do it. You go and you hit this delete all unused snapshot data. And really what that is all of the data that's sitting around of the different settings and the auto update and all of that information, it just makes the files large, starts to make the file large. And so you want to purge it and get it down. If the file does get too large, sometimes the file can become corrupted, and that's not a fun day. So by deleting the unused snapshot data, it keeps the file size a bit smaller and keeps it lean and mean. A very handy thing. The last thing I'll say is with auto update, the one place, and I wish that DiGiCo would do something to fix this, the one place where it can actually bite you is that if you go in and redo your session structure, if you go and let's say you want to reorder your groups and change something around, when you then restructure your console, when you come out of it, I guess I'll go ahead and do it. It's going to restructure it. You'll see it'll take me out of auto update, and it won't warn you. It just does it. And I'm not sure why. I'm not sure what their logic is. Maybe it's because it's rebuilding the console. It has to rebuild the entire Excel spreadsheet database underneath. And so, but that's one place where I've been bitten, where we restructure something and then we start a run, and all of a sudden you make a change to an EQ and it disappears when you take your next cue because auto update's off. And so it's just recalling what's under the hood in the spreadsheet and not auto updating it. So you always want to remember to go back. That's why I wish that it went like not just from one blue to another blue, but to like yellow or, something like that. Or it would be good if in the session structure there actually was just a button. That's what I would do, is I would say in session structure, they've got all these rebuild banks, redo this. There should be like a re-engage auto update when complete or something like that, so that you
Or at least leave your theater settings alone.
Yeah. But there's some reason for it, but it's something that's always bothered me.
Yeah.
The other one I wish you could do is that I wish in the IO rack, because I'm so meticulous about naming it, I wish there was a way to save it. I wish that you could just say, okay, like I want to import all of these names from a different project, or I want to export it, or I just want to import the entire rack settings with how it's populated.
Yeah.
It's handy when you're transferring a show, like you're going to, you start the show in Edmonton where they've got, one type of rack, and then you're going to another place where they've got the D2 or something, and you want to move all that detail over, but you don't want to have to type it all again. It would be nice if it could just remember those names. Even if it was a card at a time, it would be better than having to retype it all. But there doesn't seem to be a way other than saving the session and then reopening it. But you can't just import a rack.
No, not that level. You can do the inputs, outputs, and everything with presets or even a partial load, but nothing on the IO side.
Yeah. So if you're talking to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we're over time, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy, or thoughts or suggestions or better tricks, new tricks, other tricks. I find that the workflow is fantastic, and the ability to continue, as I say, if you think of refining the show in layers, you can kind of continue to keep doing passes and just making these things better each time. And the ability to be able to do all of this without disturbing the operator who's mixing the show is hugely powerful. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I guess what would you do if you were stuck on a non-theater style console? That would be a bit of a of a pain in the ass, I guess.
Well, I when we did Grease at the Winter Garden, whatever it was, 4 or 5 years ago, the only console we could get was a non-theater console.
Right.
And we made it work, but mostly what I did was I relaxed. I just I basically did, relax all the EQs, relax these things. I think we might have even done some goofy things like just use up more channels. So instead of having an alias, you'd have a radio socketed twice.
Yeah.
And one would be for the hat and one would be without the hat. And you just choose to unmute the, so you're chewing up more real estate that way, and it involves a bit more planning, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Yeah. And so, it's the advantage you get from the theater software is huge. I mean, the aside from the new consoles having the theater software, which would be kind of cool, I really wish the 5 had the theater software, because the layout of the console itself and where the macro buttons are was kind of perfect for theater. Mm-hmm. With the 10, the macros are kind of up and to the right. The 7, they're a little closer, I think, but there's less of them.
Yeah.
The 5 is kind of perfect layout for it, but they've never done the theater software for the 5.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard hints of it, but haven't seen it just yet. So,
I mean, I understand they're trying to keep the markets clear, and I would imagine there's a certain amount of testing that's required to make sure that it doesn't screw something else up. So maybe there's something about the 5 that's different. I don't know. Yeah. So
the other thing that you can do is you can put 40 macro buttons on the iPad, as if you want a secondary surface that you can just use for macro control.
Yeah. I mean, if it was stuff that was just for production, I wouldn't mind that, but I wouldn't want that for an important button in the console. I mean, one of the cool things with the macro buttons that you have available is the asterisk function, which is pretty fantastic. So for example, in Chorus Line, we didn't have 19 macro buttons to be able to do backups on the 19 people. But you'll see, we probably have it in here somewhere. It's hard mute. The hard mute button, for example, if you go and look at the editor for that, input channel is set to asterisk, which means that the selected channel is what is affected. So you can do the same thing with the alt input. You can have a button that will just toggle any channel to its alt input based on what's selected. So, and the workflow of that's pretty good. You know, if you're having a problem with the radio, you just select it and then hit the alt button. The 7 actually has an alt button. So I can't remember if the 10 does. If it does, it's not in a great location because this is still a great way to work. So the fact that you could have the asterisk button to affect a selected channel is great, especially with the hard mute. You're having a problem with a channel, you select the channel, you hit the hard mute button, and it's now, you know, relaxed. It's removed from automation and muted. It's not going to cause any problems until it's fixed. You get this little graphic thing to lay out your buttons, and you can have a different function for the button press and the button release. This stuff also starts to feel a lot like LCS. It scratches the LCS itch in me of being able to do, you know, all kinds of things that you dream up, which tends to be what we need in theater, because we're often using this stuff in ways that maybe the people who created them didn't intend. You know, I when they came out with the ability to be able to merge things is huge for me. The ability to take an aux and merge it back into another aux, or have an aux and merge it into a matrix. That kind of flexibility is pretty massive. So the routing possibilities are pretty great for theater too.
You get into much OSC or MIDI control on the macros or Snapshot based?
Not so much with the DiGiCo, but more and more I'm loving OSC. And so certainly if, you know, the interconnection between, say, QLab and the DiGiCo console, it opens up a whole other world of possibility to be able to manipulate with OSC, and vice versa.
I see you have some MIDI stuff in your scopes in that queue list there.
Yeah. I can't remember what we're doing with that. It might just be, it might have been reverbs. It might have been, but again, that stuff's really great, you know, and the stuff that they have, they're smart enough to realize that program changes should be simple. So they have a different editor if all you're doing is program changes, and you can just populate them through there. And then if you want to get into the more detailed bit of MIDI, you can get into you know, a lot more detail of all the different aspects of MIDI that you're playing with. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions from anybody out there? Still almost 20 of you there, so it's good. You stuck around.
That is great. I appreciate people taking the time.
Yeah.
Went pretty fast. I mean, if anybody has a question, you can send me an email, and we can talk it through.
Absolutely.
But I do recommend, like, get a hold of the offline editor and then activate the theater software and play around with it. You'll see the workflow. You'll see that it's pretty great. It's you know, and the window management is a bit awkward on the laptop if you're trying to look at, you know, doing this and then watching it happen. So it's obviously easier on a console. But I do find that even with a client-based type situation at a production table, it's amazing. You know, you get used to feeling like you're on the console.
Yeah.
So much you can do.
Very good. Well, thanks so much, Peter. Really
No
appreciate
problem.
it.
My pleasure. Lovely to see everybody.